I just realized it's been quite a hot minute since I've done one of these explaining videos. Today I want to do it on one that I've been promising for a while, that being Bethlehem. For those who are unaware, Bethlehem are a German extreme metal band that's mostly known for playing in the style of black metal. The reason why I say they are mostly known for playing black metal is for a while in their discography they experimented a lot, especially in the early 2000s to the 2010s, experimenting with styles such as metal, rock, goth rock, post-punk, and to an extent some forms of black metal were included into their sound. But the real reason that they kind of detached themselves from black metal as a whole is that they've always deemed their style of music from when they started to even present day as dark metal. Even though I said they, referring to Bethlehem, as Bethlehem is a band with multiple people in it, what's really important to point out is the one predominant member in Bethlehem that's been associated with it from its beginnings to present day, that I would argue is the heart, muscle, and spirit of this band, is Jürgen Bartsch. And I can't emphasize enough how important he is to Bethlehem, considering all the twists and turns that this band has gone through in terms of its concept and overall sound. Again, all stems from his ideas. The only other thing I want to bring up this early on with Jürgen Bartsch that I find quite odd is whenever I was doing research about him, what I would always see in the comments is people saying that his name is really messed up, thinking that it was a pseudonym for the German serial killer Jürgen Bartsch, who was active from the early 60s to mid 60s and ended up murdering 4 boys. However, that's just not the case, as the bass player for Bethlehem, Jürgen Bartsch, that is indeed his actual real name. Ironically enough though, years later, Bethlehem would end up doing an album dedicated to the German serial killer Jürgen Bartsch, as this album has more of a depiction of what someone might have gone through with their mental state to carry out such heinous and sadistic acts. And that's one thing I feel like is really important to bring up with Bethlehem as well this early on, is that even though when you look at their band logo you can see a pentagram and an inverted cross that, has to do more with Satanism and other cliches you'll find in black metal, lyrically, Bethlehem has had nothing to do with any sort of Satanism. Their lyrical themes were more focused on depicting death, suicide, and I would say other forms of mental madness that has always been attributed to the personal life of Jürgen Bartsch himself. However, even with that description of their lyrical themes, it wouldn't help Bethlehem escape some form of controversy even at their earliest beginnings with their 1992 demo. So as the story goes, back when Bethlehem were doing some of their first ever shows, their guitarist Klaus Matten gave one of their fans at the time, who was only 14 years old, a copy of their demo. The after effects of doing that would lead Bethlehem into a whirlwind of chaos in terms of lawsuits, as the 14-year-old's mother and father were really upset at Bethlehem, considering that they thought this music that they were playing, that their son was so interested in, altered their son's behavior as he became more violent and aggressive towards them. And as the story goes as well, the mother said he even built his own satanic altar in his room when he would listen to that demo. The parents of that 14-year-old tried suing Bethlehem for promoting a violent message, and because of this controversy, the labels that they were working with at the time wanted to cut out in their physical releases a lot of band photos that seemed a bit too, pro-satanic, I guess, in a way, and also wanted to censor out certain words in their booklets such as Lucifer and Satan. Basically, Bethlehem was getting censored out for promoting a message that they had no interest in ever bringing up in their music, other than at face value there's a pentagram and an inverted cross in their logo, as deep as the well goes on that conversation. And it's because of this controversy, even though thankfully they got through it years later with all the lawyers and bullshit that they had to go through, but it's a huge reason as to why it is so rare you'll see Bethlehem ever perform at a festival or do tours, It left such a strong distaste for them to do this kind of stuff. And to be honest, reading just the whole event that happened, it's like, honestly, can you blame them for not wanting to do shows after that? While dealing with that controversy, the band still proceeded on in making new music. And in 1994, they released their debut full-length album, Dark Metal. As I stated earlier, Bethlehem deems their style of music to be dark metal. And what a better way to present that to your audience with the debut full-length album being just that in the title. Now again, dark metal to them is more in the vein of real personal events that you attach with the lyrical themes, and the music kind of needs to be a representation of that. However, for a lot of black metal fans, when you listen to it, there's a lot of similarities to what be accustomed to black metal. It's raw, it's dark, it's very harsh, and again, it came out during the same time period as the Norwegian black metal boom that was happening again in the early to mid 90s. That if I had to be honest here, in terms of the styles that I hear on this album, that to make it a little bit more easier for newer listeners to make sense of it, is musically it sounds like a mixture between doom metal and black metal. Which I would argue in Bethlehem's defense, yes, it makes sense as to why they would deem it something other than black metal, as black metal's focus during this time to when even it began was always to just be harsher, meaner, and faster. And Bethlehem showcased, at least whether they meant this or not, that you can still play in the style of this dark metal, as they called it, but in this case black metal, and it doesn't always have to be at that tempo. Again, showcasing more of this emotive, depressing, slower take that I've noticed that a lot of people deem this to be the first ever album that should be considered depressing, suicidal black metal. I would say that's up for the listener themselves if they deem this to be the first ever DSBM album or not. For Bethlehem, this was dark metal, and while they were doing their own thing, it definitely struck a chord, at least with a lot of black metal fans, just because of how closely adjacent their style of music was to what was familiar with them in black metal. 2 years later, in 1996, Bethlehem would release their sophomore full-length album, and to a lot of people, including myself, it's the fan favorite, being Dictius Te Necare. And for those who don't know, Dictius Te Necare is Latin for "you should kill yourself," which again ties into the themes of death and suicide with Bethlehem. This is another album that I've talked about multiple times here on my channel, so I don't want to overstate just my enthusiasm and bias on this album. But yes, as you should all know, the selling point with this album is it's the one and only full length that they would have Rainer Landferman on vocals. His performance on this album is nothing short of signature, and it's signature because I have never heard anyone as deranged, tormented, and just crazy sounding as the vocal performance that Rainer Landferman did on Dictius Te Necare. I would also say musically, even though for black metal standards, Bethlehem is playing it pretty by the books on this album, I guess for their standards anyway, what they changed up is it feels a bit more upbeat, especially when you compare it to their demos and dark metal. That, yeah, I think it's meant to just complement Rainer's overall performance. And I feel like just, again, all round, if you want one of the most deranged and best metal vocal performances you can find, yeah, I can't help but just always recommend this album time and time again. But as to why Rainer Landferman only did this one full-length album, and technically he is a part of 2 releases in the Bethlehem discography, as in 2004 Bethlehem would release an EP called Alice Tot, which has Rainer Landferman on vocals doing an Iron Maiden cover, which is really interesting that you should check out. But as to why he was only a part of it for just such a short time period, there's no clear-cut answer. One of the reasons could be that he was also part of a technical death metal band when he was associated with Bethlehem called Pavor, where he was the bass player for that band. But that still doesn't answer the question as to why he left Bethlehem. And even in an interview that Rainer did for Decibel magazine, when he was talking about his solo album that he did back in 2019, which is such an awesome album that you guys should definitely check out if you enjoy Dictius Te Necare. He doesn't say as to why it is, saying that there's a long story, but the short story was that he just kind of like lost interest in the metal scene and attitude. But then there are rumors that Rainer Landferman focused his works on another band after he was done with the performance on Dictius Te Necare. That being, people think he's in the band Silencer. And the whole Natrum figure that you'll see when you search up Silencer is completely made up just to cloak the identity of Rainer Landferman. And the only kind of like factual evidence people seem to provide is that the vocal performance on Death Pierce Me and the vocal performance you'll hear from anything Rainer Landferman does sounds eerily similar when they do like the high wailing screams, but there's really no factual evidence that proves this. But I just find it funny that there are rumors circulating that Rainer Landferman is the vocalist for Silencer. The only other bit of information I can provide about Dictius Te Necare that I find really wild is that one of the songs on the album, it being that one, which I don't want to pronounce and butcher the German language, was featured in the closing credits to the movie Gummo. Personally, I think it's just awesome and wild how Bethlehem's music is a part of some motion picture soundtrack. Even though Gummo is kind of like this experimental drama film that I ended up watching a handful of months ago that depicts areas of Appalachia with themes of like rural decay, and it's really gritty and realistic how they interview real people to just bring out the stories, I guess, themes all the more. It's quite odd yet fascinating how Bethlehem's music kind of conveys that eerie nature of those areas with their music. And yeah, Gummo's soundtrack, it includes Bethlehem, as I just mentioned, Burzum, Bathory, Absu, and Mystifier, just to name a few. Proceeding onwards into Bethlehem's discography, an additional 2 years later in 1998, Bethlehem would release their third full-length album with an album title that's very long, and it's in German, so I don't want to pronounce it because it'll be a train wreck and a half. All I know is that the abbreviation for this album title is Suicide. This would also be the third consistent album where they would have a new vocalist, and on this album they had Marco Karen. His approach on this album vocally is more of the traditional sense you would get in black metal, with those high, wretched, raspy screams that I feel like out of everything they did in the 90s, this is their most black metal fueled and on the nose with this style of music, that even though they still deem it as dark metal, I feel like now just calling it a black metal album fits it more properly. But again, with the themes having to do with suicide, especially with the album title with its abbreviation, they still haven't lost the, at least I guess, emotional aspect about Bethlehem that they've always had since day one. What I find quite interesting about this album is that even though Dictius Te Necare is the fan favorite album, to Jürgen Bartsch, he considers this to be his best work he did with Bethlehem. Stylistically, this album resembles more of the approach they did on dark metal, where the tempo is more on the slower and mid-paced approach. The experimentation that they would do later on as we talk about some of their mid-year stuff is kind of found in here, as there's a bit of like some ambient interludes in between some of the songs, and the aggressive moments come through sporadically, like it's there but not really the meat and potatoes of what you're gonna hear. For my own personal 2 cents, I feel like this album in some sense is a bit underrated, mainly because it's so overshadowed by dark metal and Dictius Te Necare. But if you just want a straight up black metal album by Bethlehem that has a lot of the components that are familiar to your ears, definitely give this a listen. With the conversation of those 3 full-length albums finished, this is where we get to the turn of the millennia in the Bethlehem discography, and this is where they become really unorthodox. There would be 3 albums that would be a part of the experimental era in the Bethlehem's discography, making up a trilogy, that being Schatten aus der Alexanderwelt, which translates to Shadow from the Alexander Welt, The second one being Meinweg, which translates to My Way. And the third album that's a part of the trilogy, which is a lot of letters for one word for me to even attempt, but I'll just do the shortened version being Hexphobia. When it comes to a conversation of any of the 3 albums I just said, it's important to talk about them all as one cohesive unit. As Jürgen Bartsch has said, this is a trilogy that's all part of a concept. In an interview that Jürgen did for Echoes in Dust, he talks about during the late 90s, the overall creation of these albums is a reflection on his mental state, because he had a strong addiction to drugs and he lived a really solitude life. Being in that solitude environment, he created his own personal place called Alexander Welt, which is why on the first album of the trilogy you have that name in the album title. And this place that he created is where I guess he dumped all of his own personal demons in this parallel universe, as he describes it. And this album lyrically is supposed to be a narrative representation of this parallel universe that he created in his own personal head. Then in the follow-up album, Meinweg, again translated to My Way, it's Jürgen's way of trying to escape those demons. Hence why in the album artwork you see the band logo Bethlehem stamped basically right on his forehead. And in the third album of this trilogy, being Hexphobia, which I can't pronounce all of that, which is the phobia for the number 666, this is now accepting the fact that he has all of these demons and trying to live with it. As I stated earlier in this video, all 3 of these albums are done in this experimental rock metal approach, while also blending styles of post-punk, goth rock, and bits and pieces of black metal every now and then. And what he's trying to tell here in terms of all these different musical styles is all the different emotions that he undergoed to make these albums, and they're kind of like a reflection of just how mentally unstable he was with all of his own personal demons. As for each album individually, Shaitan Al-Sadur Alexander Welt, I would say it was probably my least favorite of the 3 because of just how inconsistent it is, which, yes, I'm aware I just said there's all these different styles going back and forth, but having all of these audio samples in between each track go on for like 40 seconds and then it plays into the next song just feels a bit much of a drag out for me personally. So it's not really the most like engaging of the 3 albums, but nonetheless, if you're just looking for, I don't know, creative ways of blending metal with other forms of music, definitely give this album a shot. Meinweg, on the other hand, probably has like the most post-punk influence of the 3 full-length albums. That I would say in terms of the vocal approach, it's honestly stellar. And one thing I forgot to mention is for the first time, honestly, Bethlehem had a consistent vocalist, that being Gadu Mayer, and he was part of the vocals on all 3 of the experimental albums you'll find in their catalog. And yeah, he killed it on this album. However, the one weird thing about this album is towards the very end, there's a hidden track where Bethlehem does a cover to the song My Way, originally done by Claude Vosway, but it's more famously known because Frank Sinatra did a cover of it. But as weird as it is for Bethlehem to do a cover of a song like this, the only reason as to why I can think they would do this is because the song title is My Way, and it fits the, at least, album title, again, of Meinweg. As for Hexphobia, I would say this was my personal favorite of the 3 experimental albums, just solely because it feels a bit more cohesive on the instrumental aspect. Again, there's a lot of transitions between how the genres are, the vocal approaches, and just how everything's played out, but it just feels a bit more connected in terms of the energy and vibe they're giving off. And even though I really can't guarantee people who are into black metal or know Bethlehem for their early albums will get into these particular albums, because again, it's more on this like a personal aspect that Jürgen is trying to portray here, I just feel like for people who like, left field and different and unorthodox approaches for metal and rock music can find some fascination with it, but again, I can't guarantee the black metal fans will enjoy it at all. Which now leads us back to the black metal, or in this case, dark metal approach that Bethlehem is known for. Because people tend to criticize them that they completely abandoned their sound and didn't really care about their fans at all. Again, that really wasn't Bethlehem's approach to appeal to the black metal fan base. It just happens to be that their sound is very similar to it, or in this case, adjacent to it. And while they've always been, I would at least say, interested in that dark metal and, again, very similar black metal approach, because again, as I stated, in 2004, they released that EP that had Rainer Landferman, again, on vocals, but they've always been interested in keeping that particular sound alive, because in 2009, they at least attempted to get back into black metal, at least how I look at it, with their album, A Sacrificial Offering to the Kingdom of Heaven in a Cracked Dog's Ear. Remember when I stated earlier that Jürgen said that what he believed was the best Bethlehem album was their third full-length album that's abbreviated for Suicide? Well, this album is a re-recording of all the tracks from their third full-length, only now it has Nicholas from Shining doing vocals and it's re-recorded. This is like the album in their catalog that I feel like everyone just pretends doesn't exist, because there is just, I don't know, it's just such a, it's just really not good. For starters, when I said re-recorded, I don't know what they were thinking, but it is just produced so poorly. The drums, it's just so annoying how the snare sounds that there's nothing about it that I ever want to hear again. It's like on that Saint Anger level of a snare. The mixing and mastering on the guitars are paper thin. It's really difficult to hear anything being played, and it doesn't help that Nicholas's vocal performance is so over the top, as he usually does with the Shining albums, that it just blasts through everything so obnoxiously that it just sounds like a whirlwind of a mess. Say what you will about Nicholas, but his vocals don't really fit Bethlehem's approach, other than they both have themes of suicide and just death. Because, like, there's parts in this album where he's, like, making these weird, like, ticking sounds, or, like, he laughs over everything, and it just really ruins the flow, which is quite something to do, considering that it's hard to even keep up with, like, literally anything of a flow on this album, just how poorly it's produced. It just feels like a really big misstep by Bethlehem to get back into black metal, that I don't really feel like, in terms of their, artistic direction that they were doing, as again, this was right in between the experimental era of them, that they were kind of prepared to do a black metal album. Plus, I know this is all, like, unimportant to do with the music, but the aesthetic of it, just even the band logo being changed to, like, this biker gang looking font, it just doesn't work. And the album name, too, is just such a tongue twister that seems just random and odd. I just personally feel like Bethlehem was interested in doing black metal again, or again, in this case, dark metal as they call it, and they just weren't, like, artistically, mentally in the right mindset to do so. Even with the misstep of that album, it still felt as if Bethlehem was always interested in being a part and playing black metal, or in this case, again, as they call it, dark metal. And in 2016, I felt like they did another attempt at it, but it's a lot more respectable and just overall better with their 2016 full-length self-titled album. This would be their first full-length album where they would have Yovanna, the vocalist for the black metal band Darkened Nocturne Slaughter Cult, be the vocalist for them, and she puts on one hell of a performance that rivals the just deranged sound of Rainer Landferman. Musically, again, it's something that's very similar to that of everything they did from decades past in the 90s, of that very just twisted black metal approach that we know them for, that I feel like this album, out of everything that they've done, is easily the most aggressive. While it's no secret that anyone who's trying to get into Bethlehem will always be recommended the albums that they did back in the early and mid 90s, make no mistake about it, if you want even more by them, I strongly recommend you check out the albums that Yovanna was a part of, especially the self-titled. Then, as of right now, there's their latest full-length album that they did back in 2019, titled Liebe dich leer, hopefully saying that somewhat correctly. The English translation to that being Live Yourself Empty. Again, this album has Yovanna on vocals here, and musically it really isn't that much different from the previous album, that being their self-titled, other than maybe in terms of the transitions it's a bit slower, giving off more of like that doom metal approach that they did with dark metal. But again, make no mistake about it, it still has a lot of black metal riffs and it's more black metal focused, which I feel like is something that you should kind of come to expect again, as Yovanna is the vocalist on here. And her being a part of Dark and Nocturne Slaughter Cult, her influence definitely rubs off quite a bit on the later stuff that you'll hear in Bethlehem. As for modern day Bethlehem, I feel like with all of the previous albums that they've done with the themes anyway of death and suicide, it's kind of just carried over into these last two full-length albums that you can hear. As for all the personal, abstract kind of like thoughts that Jürgen Bartsch presented in the experimental era of Bethlehem, that story's been told now. So I feel like all that's left for Bethlehem to do, and I'm not really expecting anything from them at all considering all that they have done for the past like 30 plus years that they've been active, is they're kind of just like at this point riding the wave of the legacy that they've created for themselves, and they're at the very least self-aware of it in a respectable way. As for the future for Bethlehem, I'm no fortune teller, but all I can say is of recently they kind of went through another roadblock, as Yovanna, their vocalist, was diagnosed with breast cancer back in 2021, but thankfully in the same year she went through chemotherapy, and I believe she made a full recovery considering the fact that they're playing a festival next month, that being the Prophecy Fest. Overall, Bethlehem has always been my personal favorite German black metal band. And I know with everything I said, it's quite difficult in some aspects to just call them a black metal band and that's it. But through all the difficulties that they've gone through and all the experimentation and ambition that they've showcased throughout each album, I've just always been so fond of their sound. Regardless of who the vocalist is or the styles of music that they play, they always seem to push themselves and just be exciting to me at least. And I would recommend them to really anyone who likes extreme metal. And yeah, while there are particular time periods in their discography that's kind of meant for other fan bases, just for anyone who likes ambitious music, as cliche as this is, I recommend anyone Bethlehem. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below, along with Prophecy Records web store where you can put a purchase in to some of their physical media, because I know as of recently they repressed a lot of their early albums, and get them while they're hot is all I can say. And yeah, that'll do it, guys. So like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.